Hello everyone, today we talk about the rise of the Italian signories that we have already addressed recently, and this in a completely random way. The cycle does it for us, but it's, however, a very well-known dynamic to all those who have been following the periodical section dedicated to Italy in the historical regional series. We have looked at different city-states and how, in fact, they developed and how essentially, more or less along the same timeline, they developed their own seigneurial government at a point, typically the 13th to 14th century. I've never really addressed, however, the Italian signories in a broader, more comprehensive, also theoretical fashion. Today we will in part do this. We also have not really talked much about the second half of the 14th and the 15th centuries. For this period that are otherwise, if not, again, we did for those stories of the single cities, but hardly, right, for the stories of the single houses, of the single regional states, which instead is also, I would think, the most famous period about the signories in pop culture in general. And I can't seriously explain the latter dynamic, like why we didn't talk more about that. I could digress, but this is not really the video which I'm going to explain that. What is important is, however, to frame the phenomenon in the right historical context, and definitely at least one of the reasons why, let's say, it's not really positive not to have talked about 15th century Italy in that depth, which of course is also one of our aims on Schwerpunkt, is that by far the single most, say in absolute terms, the most important period of the Middle Ages, and pretty much for every country in Europe, is really the 13th and the first half of the 14th. That's, the reasons why this is the case, both historiographically and popularly on different tracks, are not going to be debated, but to make the long story short, like, more power, bigger, say, population, more development, like it was a severe shrinking in the mid-14th century, and we haven't sort of appreciated this dynamic because very often in history we tend to look at the single, say, places, right, because from the 19th century we're mostly fixated with this sort of national boundary notion of, I will not study anything else but this place because, who cares about giving the right dimension to the same comparatively and perspectively to the others, right? And so in many ways we tend to skip especially those countries that seemed like they didn't really have much of a real national unity of some sort. This is a fallacy for Italy. You see on YouTube, I would say, many videos that stress this aspect of the chronic fragmentation, which was of course true if you pick the territorial side of the story, especially in central and northern Italy, where you have, in fact, the communes developing to city-states in parallel actually with the rise of the signoria, etc. But that, however, do not account for the actual power compaction existing within the same region and the broader cultural and actually linguistic homogeneity of this whole territory. I will not be talking about this either, right? But studying the history of, of this area, like in a general sense, is objectively difficult. It's not something you can, if you've never really heard anything about it, simply start and say, okay, well, I will have a sort of sound grasp, because very often the categories that we use to, focus in certain regions are modeled on other concepts, primarily the one of the monarchy, which is a bit the same reason why, in fact, the later Italian signories are sort of more famous than the others, because after all, they were their own monarchies in their own regard. Think about Milan, think about even Florence, at least in power concentration and facade of the Republican narrative for it. This has actually a lot to do with today's topic. The same goes for Venice, for the Papal States, and more. But the sort of more important phase in which, in fact, the Signories were born politically and institutionally has its root within the moment of greatest expansion of communal power in the region, and therefore for dynamics that are sometimes sort of equivocated. Today we talk in part about probably the terminological side of the story, not defining exactly why the term, for example, signoria came around. This can be explained also in simpler ways than it seems. Sometimes you find signories, other times lordships. Sometimes you find probably the Italian terms, like also in foreign historiography, because it's really particular, and there being really lots of inks, rivers written about this. Let's put it in this way. But as a matter of fact, there is also and I think this is really important, a sort of aura, sort of attitude that, I don't know how to say, an ideological semantic of some sort that is often attached to the city-states' history and the way their political development occurred historically. That has to do a bit with the sort of the Black Legion of the dark, say the splendid from one side, but sort of bloody and treacherous Renaissance politics that also is mixed a bit with this broader idea of decadence that marries well in the later Renaissance, also with the Black Legion, with the Reformation, the decline of the Catholic world, and so on. So there is a lot going on. If you think about how many people know just the name Borgia, for example, and how much that is connected with an idea, for example, of the papacy or the Italian Renaissance, and how much literally, like what happened in the 13th, 14th century, like I think most people do not literally have the palest idea of what technically it really had ever been. I mean, there is a disproportion in the way we culturalize this concept, two extremes of quite subjective, say almost fantasy narrative that somehow stuck with the audience, we can't say, because I treat it as a sort of fiction in itself, and how much, in fact, of the cool stuff, also in strictly historical terms, we have sort of missed out. So we will make a blend of these topics, and then we will talk also about what is considered, if not the first lord proper, but surely sort of the most important one, that is Ezzelino da Romano, that I already discussed elsewhere, where in northeastern Italy in the mid 13th century, and we will see better what it is. And I think it's important to start from here because it's not just like the first chronologically, but it also, like, if you know his story, it overlaps more or less with Frederick II's reign, and so the entire, like, the power delegation that this guy was originally a Guelph, actually received by the Holy Roman Emperor to become actually one of the most authoritative and apparently authoritarian Ghibelline leaders in such a strategically crucial area like the one of the Trevisan Mark, the Adige/Etch Valley, like in the Verona, etc. And there is really like a lot to say, so I will try to stick just to the sketch, and then of course we will be talking much greater detail about all the stuff at some point. But sometimes, like literally, like now, I don't even know how it makes sense to start from one thing or rather than another. But the terminological aspect is relevant because when you look at the way in which in the 13th century the political life in the city-states of the Italic kingdom began to develop this new kind, properly, of politician, but also of commander, like of general leader, right? We, at least, I will speak strictly for sort of the Anglosphere and how probably the terminology used in Anglo-Saxon historiography really may still sound. we come across terms like tyrant or despot, right? Tyrant is somehow legitimate because the same Italians at a point made a use of it, which was even properly praising the Signori, especially for Milan. One of the very, very first videos on Schwerpunkt I made is exactly about this, right? That is a terminology thrown around by Coluccio Salutati. There is all the archetypal dichotomy of Florence versus Milan, right? The monarchy versus the republic, something like that. And that's also very blurred. But the term despot is some sort of anachronism, which, as far as I'm aware of, is used. I don't know whether it's still used because I don't find it much around. Admittedly, I don't read much stuff in English about Italian communes, but it's a term that we came across incidentally as recently in the last video I made about, I think it was the 17th century brutality, if you remember it correctly, in which at a point there is a passage from a letter sent by a papal legate that was describing the objective authoritarianism of Murad IV, calling him or his rule despot/despotic, which is a very it's actually a very interesting side of the story, because this was happening in the 17th century, and as we will see now, the term despot would become sort of relevant in world historiography, because, say, Anglo-Saxon historiography began to dominate it to some extent only in the following one, in the 18th century. In 18th century England, we will look at the very origins of the term, which is a term which like tyrant actually has an ancient classical Hellenic origin. I also recently made a video about the Battle of Pelagonia that, as you know, was fought by the despotate of Epirus. So there was this term thrown around, like the Renaissance, the study of the classics, etc., had sort of revived it, even though the term despot is not so resounding, like tyrant, for example, in say from probably even ancient history, right? So the term despotism requires an explanation. So first of all, this idea is attributed to the concept of the Signori tout court, right? We don't have enough time to talk about this, but essentially there is an acceleration in the development of some concentrated, the power concentration. Like somebody would say, regarding the same lords, a monarchical power, but it's definitely too much. It wasn't anything like this. These governments were really, in many ways, Republican. Doesn't matter who was at the top, right? It's just like saying that there is a monarchy because you have a president. That's even if some prerogatives of many presidents in the world are extremely, they do derive actually from the monarchy. Think about countries like France. There are countries that for unity of command sort of maintain enormous say necessity of, say, the power concentration in single higher institutional figures, even in essentially in republics, right? And this is a similar thing. Like Frederick II had during his rule in Italy tried to essentially, he had fought bitterly, as you know, against the Lombard League, and Italy was split essentially between a pro-imperial and a pro-papal factions. Of course, I stress the pro-papal because the Guelph position was hardly so ideologically coherent or outlined as the pro-imperial Ghibelline one. But we will talk about this another time as well. And Frederick had tried, from the Ghibelline side, of course, to co-opt lots of key figures, with Ezzelino actually from a Guelph ruler that could be both from the other side, and there was a lot of back and forth depending on the situation, especially when you have 30 city-states that are simultaneously like competing against one another. And so the idea is, especially after the death of Frederick II, is that these figures, these characters at a local level start, once the war with the emperor is over, and they can spend resources to fight against one another to rebuild from this, not just the resources that were freed, but from these new political categories that were, as we will see now, and I can't stress it enough for this period, for this generation, just like not radical. It was not revolutionary. Like the idea of the Lord is just let's have a leader. Let's think about the figure of the podestai. It was already around, like a guy that is called to actually obey to the local government and constitution and councils, etc., and just is to be entrusted with, I don't know, with the control of the police or the command of the army during the public expeditions, things like that, right? So it began really, slowly, right? And the communal government was already, by this point, essentially oligarchic in nature. Could say aristocratic if you do not want to stress, especially in the cases, the more republican cases of popular government, such thing. Among the comments, I realized that the term communal confuses people. We have treated this in other episodes, but the commune in itself has nothing to do with the communistic commune, like what Marx and Engels were talking about. The Italian communes were founded by the consular military elite, right? The equivalent, essentially, of the feudal order in the Italic kingdom, at least in terms of those who held power. Also, during the popular phase, this was ruled by very powerful, mostly mercantile families that were involved in. They were also fighting as a duty and as form, but a privilege as well as heavy cavalry, like being the equivalent again of the feudal one in a time. And none of Italian communal history was anything like, as no other at the time in traditional cultures, oriented towards any sort of communistic endeavor, just like the rebellions and the quickly put down rebellions in the Flemish and Italian communes by the salaried workers, right, of the textile industries after the mid-14th century crisis, just like the Jacquerie in France, etc. It could have a tendency like that. It has absolutely nothing to do with the structure of the communal institution. Commune has nothing to do with communistic. Just, I mean, it feels dumb to need to explain this, but I did find some uncertainty somewhere. So at least at a popular level, of course, historiographically, we know this pretty well. And so I say this also because, in fact, to stress the graduality in the development of a more concentrated power, right? The communes had not been about this form of solitary monarchical government. The Italian cities had never really been ruled in that fashion. There had always been some power sharing. This is typical also for practically every urban community out there. It's just a society of orders, right? Hierarchically stratified, also both spiritually, but also territorially. We can say vertically and horizontally. So this is true pretty much for everyone. Now, the imperial, like the Frederick II's cooptation, let's put it in this way, had surely left a mark, especially during the times of war, where you need more political unity, the suspension of certain rights, etc. Not that at this point, like literally the situation was regressing in terms of individual liberties, but gradually, like, you know, even in spite of the broader expansion, right, of power at the highest level from the mid-13th century, especially in levels of concentration in the world, in this region, you have still, say, governments that were, in fact, essentially republican in nature. Well, the lords begin here to, again, this is not a categorical office. There's not such thing like, okay, you're the lord of the city, because you're conceived as if you could lord over it. No, it's completely absent from the Italian political culture as a concept. It's rather a guy that is entrusted gradually multiple offices from the ones already existing within the commune. All right. There are, of course, some offices that are more important than others. There are new titles modeled depending also on the duration, on the faculties, and so on. But it's hardly anything particularly stable. But we're talking still, again, powerful clans that have become quite prestigious, even just because of their cooperation with the empire, not only. We're talking about, for example, the Este in Ferrara, the Della Torre in Milan, and the Della Scala in Verona. These clans had different origins. The Este and the Della Scala, the Della Torre were actually descending from some of the most ancient nobility in Europe, probably the feudal one of Carolingian origin, or say the one of, not necessarily from Carolingian dynasty, but from the Frankish one in Italy. The La Scala that would become at some point even more powerful than these guys were instead emerging from the local magnates in the textile industries. Right, the power was comparable, really. Yet it remained informal. Right, you can measure it, but every city again has its own offices and titles and dynamics and whatever. One important dynamic that we're not going to look at today is that what really characterizes the first lordships in a consistent sense is the fact that they paradoxically start as multi-city domains, meaning that since power could not really be concentrated too much in one city, there were different offices held by a single guy in different cities that were essentially coordinating each other, because think about the Lombard League, the Veronese one, etc. There was an ancient connection between all these various cities in terms of political and military coordinations. The amount of manpower, material was really insane, and the wars against the emperor had sort of highlighted it. And now these were not stopping, right? The Italians basically have never spent so much for war, and they keep fighting essentially with the highest degree of belligerence in the entire, at least in Europe, and I suspect in the rest of the world. The interesting thing about the former houses is that figures like Azzo d'Este, Martino della Torre, and Mastino della Scala, that are a bit like the founders of these families' fortunes in this sort of ex post perspective, had been passing their personal power as single leaders, in fact, to their heirs, whichever they were. Recently made a video about medieval Milan, and we observed that pretty well for the Della Torre, right, and how they, step by step, like a sort of the various relatives got this power in the city, and the lordship was sort of materializing at every step of the way, but quite, in fact, a long one chronologically. It was the communes that were giving power to these people, right? It's not like that was even, let's say, a populistic push for it. At this time, we're talking about still the sort of functional virtues, popular regime, and actually the cities that work the best historically with the Signori are the ones that in fact have the strongest support from the Republican order. I'm talking Pisa especially. That is a bit of an exception, admittedly. Northern Italy is permeated a bit more by this sense of nobility, rather than, say, Tuscany is mostly associated with a sort of greater Republican bias. It's a bit overstated in a categorical sense. Actually, the Lombard and Tuscan communes were fairly similar with one another. But we have observed how especially until the early 14th century, this single leader choice was actually quite functional, also to assert the rule of single cities over others. That is the great step that basically happens only in Italy, and that allows, in fact, the cities to become, as we were saying before, sort of, regional states comparable to other great powers in Europe. Now, during some of we see popular elections calling these guys to power in Ferrara in 1264, in Mantua in 1299, the Este and the Bonacolsi respectively. Again, every city has its history. For example, Ferrara had an old liking for the Signori, right? They have a people that has always wanted to be under a lord, right? Whereas other cities have it sort of more suspicious towards the lordship by inclination. It's just the neighboring Bologna, for example, is a bit like the hallmark of popular regimes for up to significantly late in time. This depended again on different political and social segmentation within the city. That's why I make the Italian communes also in the original series so in depth, because it's important to follow the history of everyone to understand what we're talking about. And so there you have the foundation. Like if you look at the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, aside from certain backs and forths of some dynasties that were exiled, etc., for in the communal politics, etc., you have the foundations of what would have become the principalities and regional states of Renaissance Italy. And the Visconti in Milan, the Este in Ferrara, the Gonzaga in Mantua, the Gonzaga overthrew, in fact, the Bonacolsi we mentioned before, the Montefeltro in Urbino, even though they came essentially also from other more isolated places. Again, all different contexts, actually, that deserve the accurate attention dedicated to each one. Now, by 1300, essentially most cities of northern Italy were under some sort of seigneurial rule, right? Every city had developed mostly at that point, which was before Henry VII's expedition and especially the great boost of the Ghibelline seigneuries by imperial backing that formed some of the most powerful states. Like they had developed their own commune, their own city seigneury, right? And even those cities where this had not yet happened would soon follow. If you look at Padua, we will talk about this now because of Ezzelino, had historically remained very popular in nature. Again, the city was run by very rich clans, but the popul again is something different from, you would think, the people, the commoners in a communal context. Parma as well would have the da Correggio, the Rossi later. Vicenza would be given literally like and as directly to the La Scala of Verona by Emperor, but by at that point actually still King of the Romans, Henry VII, in a few years. Now, this is the general picture. Now, coming back to the word despot, right? How did this come about in the first place, and how especially was it attached, like historiographically, to late medieval Italy in particular? And again, this seems to have happened just in the Anglosphere. Again, I'm not aware, and I'm very careful about this because I like very much this connection between historiography and pop culture, but pop culture reads parts of this historiography, may be influenced by it, but may also have not interiorized it. So it does seem, again, that this is just an English peculiarity. Yet I haven't heard the term despotic thrown much around. It's sort of an unusual term in English anyway, and yet it was also attached, and it actually especially attached to the Italian signories, right? Other countries had different terms. In Italian, it's the signorie for the signories, the signori for the lords individually. In French, it's seigneur. And I have actually a playlist dedicated to seigneurial Europe, which doesn't have to do, in fact, with the what I call rather the Italian lordships, to differentiate it a little bit for this sake, but that would be also the correct term for the lordships, in fact, that were forming post-Carolingian Europe, like during the Vassalitic beneficiary system, sort of all the age of encastellation, probably from the 9th to the 11th century, something like that. In Germany, you have Tyrannen, which is very interesting because it follows probably the Italian dialectic of tyranny, republic that was ongoing in the Renaissance, especially with these models like Milan versus Florence, etc., and which also refers as tyranny to, of course, the old concept of tyranny, which in fact, when you look at despot, it's also something that was consciously emerging as, like, it's not that we use them with a negative bias necessarily, even though in our languages it does sound so, because these were actually offices in the Hellenic city-states back in the day, devoid of this, again, negativity. Again, if I had to explain to you how we arrived to that semantics, we should have an entire video on it, but this would say isolate from today's topic, so it's not that important. In any case, it's obvious that the concept of despot is connected with this, just like, oh my god, he's a despot, like, it's just guy was so oppressive and unequal and sort of even violent, like, unjust fundamentally. This it's not a concept just connected to the harshness of the government, but also to the caprice of its ferocity, of almost indiscriminate butchery. And in fact, as we were saying before about the 18th century, it was a term that was first applied actually to, and eventually connected a bit with the Oriental rule over sort of slave people, so that this kind of Eastern Orient, let's say that this view of the East as the place populated by essentially people who have been deprived of their own individual liberty, and they're sort of weak and oppressed by autocrats, which is not even that wrong, telling the truth. But that's where the point makes you think, because Italy at this point was actually, even within the same Europe, the single most autonomous, like the people living in the same Italian communes under the lords, under these despots, were actually the single sort of, not just freer, but richer people in the entire world, literally. Like Florence had the highest per capita wealth in the world. The same Italy would maintain that up to for a long time. So also all the period of the signories of the Renaissance, etc., was, if you think about it, as we're mentioning before about the Borgia, the Duke Valentino, etc., it's all about, oh my god, those guys were these kind of, again, capricious, evil, creepy guys, like a bit like, I don't know, mafia bosses and whatever. And the idea is it's remained in this decadentistic concept of, say, the Italian commune that sort of was rich, but that's sort of connected with evil, right? So this eventually falls, and there are these dark figures that take over. It's all about the decadence of this culture, and its sort of bloody plots and instability and whatever. This is fascinating because it sort of belittles the role of the lords as well. You see, in a way, there is this terms come around in the 18th century. So the English have already sort of epurated their own monarchy from most of its power, actually, that they deemed as negative, and then mostly it's the parliament that matters at that point. So is it still a monarchy? But it's the special monarchy, right? The one that allegedly, since the Magna Carta would have achieved who knows which great result. Actually, the Magna Carta was a disaster for England. That had, at that point, by far one of the single greatest power as in terms of monarchical states in Europe. And since the shipwreck of the White Ship, like fell again into this series of wars that severely undermined monarchical authority, and so all the various provisions, the constitutions of Clarendon, whatever, like those are like the active shrinking of monarchical power. The English lose essentially like their French possessions within. The thing is replicated in the 100 Years' War. France emerges actually as the most powerful country, and there is all an enormous debate that one could, of course, express about the why a concept like the one of despot would emerge from a context like the Anglo-Saxon one of the 18th century. It would have been different even from the one of the 17th, and that in fact would sort of surprise you if you were to look at how different sort of the the political bar, like in terms of historical semantics, before the Civil War, the revolutions actually was. Like, consider that England notoriously sort of hit at a certain point in its history, historiographically, the fact that they had had a revolution, because they had to essentially reject anything that made them anything similar to the French in that manner. So, what heavy concept, gravid concepts to analyze, and Italy was chosen for the application of this concept of the Signori as tyrannical despots, which it's not, I mean, the term, it comes around the 18th century, right? But it's not before the 19th that, especially through the historian Hallam, that was writing, in fact, about the Italian signories, commented something like, quote, "I know not of any English word that characterizes them except tyrant in its primitive sense," which is a clever phrase, because in its primitive sense means what we were saying before, like the tyrannos in the Hellenic polis, which was just a stronger form of regime, like monarchically oriented, but still within, like, properly a political body of some sort of essentially republican tone. And the Hellenic polis were not democracies either. Like, we should make an enormous digression of what we think by democracy, because definitely democracies do not exist. They have never existed. The demos is not, if not numerically, sort of the majority of the voters, but we do not live in a direct democracy, at least, like, so in a way in which literally the demos dictates what must be done, right? That doesn't exist. It has never existed historically, right? Not even in most extreme cases. And so it's wrong, in my opinion, to think that we live in democracies, but it's a good thing that we don't, but not that, however, just concentration in the hands of a single guy would be better. No, the other opposite is disastrous as much as the democratic one. And so this, at least what Hallam wrote here was sort of philologically correct, and the term is applied eventually to the Italian signories. And already at the time, there was a sense that the despot, again, was the other, right? The Oriental, very often, this thing that was alien sort of to what at that point, especially think about the British Empire in the 19th century, had become, like, together with France. This was the sort of this most narrowly Western, Northwestern European reality. Italy is still, actually only at this time in history, lagging behind, at least still within the main Western countries, at least in the broader geographical sense, by standards, etc. And of course, there was much, even in the British interest in the revisitation of figures like, I don't know, at the time, Garibaldi, the Risorgimento, again, the idea that this country needed to be helped because it had sort of declined, because Rome was over, because the Renaissance was over. And so it seemed sort of relevant that, the lords, after all, would have allegedly undermined this system. Mostly, again, the bias was anti-papistic. There is no doubt about this. I mean, the main reason why even the Protestant historiography began to mock sort of not just Rome, but the Italians as the Renaissance, at least the carriers of that broader culture in the 16th to 17th century, was definitely the Reform, the Counter-Reform, and I don't know, for example, Venice, that admittedly did not have lords in that regard, but was, for example, keeping the Inquisition out during the Renaissance, and lots of Protestants went there for their books and whatever, was considered an honorary, in fact, Protestant counter by the Protestants in Europe. So everything was very bent to different, like the sum of different historical, like, perception. The 19th century is also the great center of the mass Italian immigration, especially from the most underdeveloped places in the peninsula, and so there is all a sort of negative bias that begins to sort of sit in, even from some concepts that were up to that point really unknown and used, right? Up to the 18th century, for example, the Italian immigrants were rich, educated people. Like, they were welcomed, and there was a completely different view of what, say, the entire sense of this national culture really was about. That's the Signories were really embodying in one another, because at the end of the day, Italy was ruled by the Signories. Even if you essentially pick the Neapolitan kingdom, the papacies were, again, de facto monarchies on their own, and then you have seigneurial governments and or extremely powerful people in the republican ones that are, think about the doges of Venice or Genoa, etc. So these are still some sort of monarchs, and this is kind of obvious because there's always a leader, there's always a head of some sort. From the Stato of the United Provinces to, I don't know, to the Russian Tsars. Like, that's in the range, you always have a leader of some sort. So you can't play with the topic, right? But can't play with the depths of the semantics, the meanings, the sort of the imaginary, how this history, by the way, in the 19th century was being written. Essentially what we study today as medieval history was founded in the 19th century in a serious way, right? That you have, of course, in the 17th, the 18th, also from the 16th, actually, from as we'll learn now, the very Italian chroniclers of the end of the 13th, the early 14th century are really pre-humanistic sources that really start creating what we intend in the West. Narrowly meant our way of our modernity, as a matter of fact. Like, so, it's really an enormous historical bundle to sort of to try to dissolve here, to find the core of it. And so there is all a concept that I actually found, like, the dichotomy sort of single-guided rules and the people rule is incredibly eradicated in the Anglo-American culture. I see it from the comments. Most of you are from the United States and from the UK, Australia, Canada. And over the years, like, again, this is not a matter of average, but it happened to me to receive, with millions of views, like, comments that we're appreciating the various historical topics we're discussing, and that displayed this. Like, there's tendency to extremization. It's really normal. It's present in every culture, but the notion that you always have to watch your back because there may be a tyrant who wants to tread on you is, it's absolutely legitimate. I think it is something that every person should always check, but it takes on the sort of, metaphysical and meta-historical character of, say, of a category through which you should interpret the entire history or the entire politics. And so either, like, a system is, there is a tyrant, or it's a tyranny, or it's, people are free or whatever, especially with, in populistic subculture, in, conspiracy theories, etc. The idea is always there is a giant, let's say, hidden, let's say, the power that pulls the string of the world, and the poor martyrs of the innocent average person that are notoriously such bright, intelligent, capable, educated, successful, hard-working individuals, are nobody knows, like, why they're still alive with this enormous power that could crush everybody, because in these stories, in these plots, there is never, like, the hero, like, not even the actual people in that sense, or at least if not in an intentional sense. There is a sense of defeatism and negativity that is the same one that makes us, lose wars and opportunities, even though we have all the power we could easily leverage from a day to another. And so whenever you, like, this takes sometimes also national semantics. If you think about another country that is outside of, say, the greatness of the United States, which to some extent is true. We all know, say, that the current times are not particularly, exemplificative for that. But in a general sense, I also don't have any contrary to what some people would like to attribute, and me also for different political reasons. I don't have, but fundamentally, sympathy for Anglo-American culture. Like I don't never saw it as even as a continental European, as a sort of antagonist or as the evil guy, right? Because many people really do. I don't, but I can recognize within different cultures, our own have, of course, different other issues like that. So this is not a criticism or a complaint. But this is important to understand the topic we're discussing. Of course, there is this idea that if it is not our gold standard, it has to be either crap or fundamentally just something you should always look upon with suspicion, right? And a bit like the complexity and the difficulty in the understanding, again, in the very complicated Italian history that is also not taught adequately, to say the least. Probably not even, well, anywhere, like starting from Italy, but that you would suppose to be the place where people learn about it the most, but that has also received, in my opinion, like some sort of pretty scarce attention. At least it's even this period, like if you study European history at this point, you realize that there are entire periods as eras that have been missed out, have been chewed into some different sort of didactical separation, like of eras, etc., and crammed in different ways, crushing or missing out. Like it's terrifying, and so legitimately, and we're sort of biologically designed for that. We're always suspicious about things that we do not know, hence understand. Then you can have a negative judgment about them, but you can't feel empowered to dominate them. But when you do not know them, even the thing that is kind of good looks like dark by definition. This is like the analogy with the Dark Ages. They were dark because they were sort of less documented than the others, but there wasn't really nothing particularly dark about those, like compared to other centuries as well, if you attach a sense of general evil or accomplishment or whatever to that concept, to that word. And so the Italian signories were sort of seen as, even to the extremes of something that never existed in traditional culture. For example, like the lords were not really sovereign powers. They were never really conceived as such, right? These were still technically individuals that were chosen to rule on behalf of the commune, of this public authority, and the general community. Absolute masters. This is a concept that we applied even to an entire era in European history, that is the age of absolutism. The 18th century, which instead is absolutely, in fact, not, it is not, right, by a substantial degree, an absolute power. Absolute comes from Latin, means essentially so free from any constraint, and basically in this context, like as if, I don't know, the King of France or the King of England could simply decide whatever, and all the subjects, obeyed. This is nonsense that we leave for the sort of most mentally deranged, communistic, anti-traditional, nightmares and other issues that those people have. Really, the 18th century is a gigantic effort from these monarchies to actually start making things work on the basis of a state, of a centralized public authority can make things work and homogenize and rationalize and order and regulate and discipline, whatever, out of which actually the 19th century absolute state emerges, that is the one that from the Code Napoleon decides that the only source of law is the state, right? And that is actually the civil law, which again has its own, like traditionally, like in again it is to be considered as a negative, because people should hopefully have the amount of individual liberty to rule themselves by their own, but they're fallen, right? And the way civilization tries to put patches to make things work, actually this is a step forward. And even in the countries of common law, of course, you know that individual power is not as strong as before, because fortunately we live in a country where as we were just saying before, like this is not a democracy in which actually just, even if we often don't see it because legitimately as Westerners, even if we don't realize that we have high standards compared to other peoples, basically to anybody else, it's people who know how to make things work that actually make them work, right? And so the rest of the masses being, especially now, ever more sinking because they're, the system starts to stagnate and even to contract, and so those are the first ones to go because legitimately without accomplishments you cannot ask to be paid for life for doing nothing. So the Italian lords were by far, especially as any other medieval ruler, extremely distant from anything like absolute masters, right? Not even the Emperor of China was an absolute master, literally, and Italy again is probably the diametric opposite reality in this sense. There was still, again, traditionally aristocratic oligarchy in nature, there's no doubt, but not absolute. Some other concept about the Signori, especially from the later times, I made a video about the Gonzaga about this, is the idea that these were some sort of strong men from military families that sort of took over power, like military coup or something, and that imposed their, in fact, despotic rule. That's not the case. There were some lords that had emerged from the crafts of arms and or that literally sold, like from a pregress seigneurial position, their services as condottieri later on, but this was just like proper of the entire, Eurasian establishment. Like everybody had a military training, they went at war, that's basically the only thing they had to do, and this is sort of normal and overwhelmingly documented. Also, hereditary principalities is not really true. Yes, there were some dynasties, as we pointed out, that were able to affirm themselves in a, family successory system, but this was never like, okay, just because you're my son, there is an absolute right in our constitutions here that has to make that the next ruler. Like the rulers were always legitimized by the people, by its councils, its institutions. This is true also for kings out there, yet there is a dynastic principle in that case that is in fact affirmed differently from essentially most of the Italian situation, but it's even in that case subject to scrutiny. Like if you do not perform well, the parliament will not support you and will even rise in arms against you, will overthrow you, will put another monarch on the throne. So, which is pretty messed up, of course, but it's not the normality of the legal, what the legal manual of how to do things, but it's still what happens. Think about all the wars, like of from the 100 Years to the One of the Roses, right? So it's all about dynasties, right? And in fact, are these countries seen as despotic compared to the much more markedly republican Italy? No, right? It's the Italian lordships that for some reason get this attribution. It's especially Sismon's prolific, repeated use of the word, like the age of the despots, that especially instilled this, not just terminology, but properly the tone of like, what the hell were these guys, right? And it would have been really fascinating to tell, because if anything, of all the difficulties that they individually had to rule, to these very Italian lords, whether they would have felt to be things like absolute masters or, simply hereditary rulers or whatever, right? So to come back a bit on Earth, of course, it's not an easy topic, as I was telling before. Right, there were different ways the Italian lords called themselves. In fact, lords, which is not the English equivalent. It would be signori, in fact, as so the seniores, like the senior element, which is the same again, concept of serfs, certain, in fact, elements of nobility, even though here it's another one, also because the Italian city-states did not really have, per se, unless it overlapped with it for some reason of feudal hierarchy in the Holy Roman Empire, a specific trait of nobility. Like these guys, usually, some, as we've seen, were noblemen from, again, some of the ancient and most ancient lineages in Europe, but others were simply emerged from the communal aristocracy that in Italy was based on census. If you were rich enough, you were an aristocrat of some sort. You could participate. You had to the councils with certain rights, whatever. So that's what mattered. That's how many people like emerged in this context in the first place, autonomously, right? Governor was another gubernator in Latin. That's the term sometimes comes. Rector, captain, very often also captain of the people, which was not technically like the captain, for example. There were other captains. One of the mercenary, the communal mercenaries, or the one of the people was sort of felt more like the insider, like the inside within the gate sense of the community of the citizenry, the popular paramilitary associations that this guy was as the head of, that could, in fact, and would carry out coups and in the seas of public power within the city, the normally the main squares, with this powerful infantries that within the city, the narrow city streets of the medieval cities would put in great difficulty cavalry that otherwise was dominating outside of it. Also, the term of tyranny came about, as we were saying before, and interestingly enough, this was embraced, especially by Milan, it was, let's say, first of all, the most efficient of the Italian states in this period. Like Milan, we've seen it recently, like it had literally created the single most homogeneous, sort of statally functional and compact and military powerful, by the way, domain in Italy. And these guys had done so thanks to, of course, the city of Milan was the largest in Europe. It was incredibly rich, but also to the seigneurial form of government, the Visconti di Sforza, and that had also, of course, a dynastic principle, rule, etc. So they incarnate a bit more the most authoritarian, as in fact tyrannic regime, which, however, was the most functional, and also the one that used as the temper of the Renaissance, with the discovery of ancient Greek, etc., in the proper way. Like, tyrant is not a negative word. It is for us, and mostly through the anti-tyranny bias that Anglo-American culture has since the Middle Ages. I mean, it's a later expansion for the War of American Independence, etc. So something that was reinforced right over time, and that, since Anglo-American culture is still hegemonic, is deeply ingrained in how we see the world ourselves, and that is actually to commend, to the extent it, to the principles, to the philosophical, to the political, logical, juridical concept that it expresses. Again, and what I was saying before is that every country has a different balance. It has actually similar balances, or even better ones, independently from the matrix, right? That's what I was saying before, is that today there are people who go as far as saying, I don't know, after all, there are some certain countries in the world that are okay because, they call themselves like they are a republic or federation, they have a parliament, they have an elected leader. Well, yes, except the entire system is fucked up and rigged and unbalanced, and life is, is disgraceful. They live 10 years less than a European, like than Western European, or like that's essentially like, what are you trying to say there? That just because this is like apparently not a tyranny in brackets, that this is somehow more of a this is what, for example, Putin once was asked, like, what is, what do you think about Western democracies? And he said, what are Western democracies? There are not. Like, the UK is a kingdom, and France is a republic. Where is that? It's an invention, as if to distract the reality that, again, a Russian lives, say, 10 years less than an Italian or a German, and that there is a much greater level of, social and political functionality and life quality and military capacity. Whatever. Never mind that, right? Never mind what we all have as Westerners. It's about this formalistic structuralism, which is radically ingrained in socialistic and fundamentally lesser people's mentalities, right? It's distracting from quality and standards, because those are the first enemy of. And the same goes with history. Like, with history, you focus only on certain words, and you fundamentally do not know what lived in the veins of these institutions. You cannot measure their positivity in the history of mankind, their impact as civilizations, right? So this is the paradox. It's not to say, for example, that the Italian communes were necessarily a better or worse government, let's say, polities than I don't know, a feudal monarchy, right? But why did the term despot come to be associated with those, when in Europe actually the average was truly a monarchical government that was much more strongly and sort of macroscopically regimented in a dynastic sort of truly seigneurial power that would aim towards this monopolization and military control and sort of maintain an hereditary continuity and whatever, right? So why would the Signori be singled out as tyrants or despots, right? Again, for Milan, the thing was thrown around in the debate between Florence and, in fact, the Milanese Signori, because the Florentines said, "Oh, look, we are republic, and we had it." And yes, because Tuscany was a state, like the Florence. We still have to make some videos to explain this well, but it had basically been able, just out of the sheer banking power they had, like the financial power, they didn't even need to conquer militarily Tuscany. They was essentially hegemonize it financially. And so what emerged from this was a sort of confederacy headed by Florence that said, look, we haven't conquered systematically our neighbors like the Milanese do, and we're not a signory, whatever, even if the Medici in the 15th century would actually buy the entire city and rule it as single rulers, right? But so you understand, even a bit, there is indeed a bit of hypocrisy from that sort of Italian and fundamentally Florentine mentality that in fact prevailed in the letters, in the arts, in politology, Machiavelli, etc. If you had asked the Milanese, it would have been a bit different story, because they liked the term tyrant, and they enjoyed the idea that the single unity of power was sort of more functional than the other system. Which was also painfully showed by the fact that the Florentines sucked at war. It's hard to say that, let's say, if there is some Florentine out there, but that's the truth. Like, that lack of unity, there were, again, pros and cons, but still Florence survived and emerged over many other cities that didn't make it, including the ones that she brought down. But definitely there was something about, say, even the Florentine weakness at some point in the Renaissance, politically and militarily, that had to do with that sort of, and that's something that continues along, like, because if you study, for example, the history of Florence under, like in the later modern era, even under the Habsburgs, right, they were, that was a single branch of the Habsburg, like that was Lombardy and the Veneto area later, that were literally ruled by the part of the Habsburgian Empire. Tuscany was out of this, like was independent, but the Habsburgs, a branch of the Habsburg ruled there, and this country was one of the single most sort of liberal for the times. They abolished slavery, like very early on. They had all very mild policy towards like corporal punishment. There's all a culture that emerges from there. Part of the reason is because of this root in the late Middle Ages of this more republican sort of less constrictive system that otherwise would have survived in Milan if at that point it had not been conquered by the Spanish, etc., as an independent power. So you understand how relevant these concepts really are, because they have all history in Western philosophy and politics, etc. Like tyranny is actually the one who stood out best, not much because of Anglo-American culture, but because of Aristotle's influential definition, right? Which is in fact used back in the late Middle Ages in the very common condemnation of the seigneurial regime, right? Because of course there were similarities in sort of, again, the excess of the corruption of power, say, of the monarchy, the monarchic system in Aristotle's political, classification, right? So this also revolves around, in fact, the idea between not the single ruler in itself, but whether he's a good or a bad guy, really a just and unjust one, especially if he ruled in the interest of the collectivity, or if like for his own interest alone. And so that's how Aristotle had sort of differentiated the two figures, and also provided with some ways to deal with that. And so that's why the negative bias of the word tyrant had sort of stuck and was already present, was already known in pre-humanistic times. And so there is obviously always a controversy revolving around the even, of course, the same power taking, right? Today we do not make an evidential history, hopefully we will have to make it, of how these guys took power. Now we will talk about Ezzelino briefly. But of course, like this, the affirmation of the Italian signories did happen through pretty bad things, right? Not much just because of the individual ways these guys rose to power, but how like the community was faring overall. Wars, impoverishment, like this is typical in many ways, but also functional, because these communities really needed a strong man to sort of protect it at some point, and there wasn't much of another way. The same communes, I mean, in more Florentines had, as we were just saying, they called it they placed in power the lords themselves, and initially it worked also pretty well, right? It conferred the communes, especially in this phase, the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, a level of political stability and military power that was not to be seen, and in such a turbulent moment in which it was needed, and in which, in fact, these cities begin to literally take each other out politically, which had not happened before. Before, the communes were developing towards in fact, more power concentration, subtle direction. They were not city-states yet, and nobody could literally take out one another, rule over another. At this point, instead, the city-state has the capacity to literally crush the neighboring one and install its rule over it. Right, so that's where the crisis comes, but it comes only in the place that loses. The place that wins, actually the Signori is successful. And that's the thought-provoking dynamic here. Then the Italians at the time, and we've seen it in many videos, were producing a hell of a, essentially the top juridical science of the era, right? The Bolognese school had literally, we've seen it, the so-called Mos Italicus had been taken over together with Roman law, basically the entire Western Europe. We will keep talking about this. I think we finished that. We have to see, like at least in the main European countries. Yes, we made recently Spain and Germany, and we had already done France, and so yeah, that's pretty much what we will be covering. But in the 14th century, of course, there was a lot, especially in function of these new regimes, that was being elaborated at the peak, by the way, of communal civilization, so the most refined of the period. And the greatest jurist of his time that would eventually inform, in fact, the Bolognese doctrine to the point that was said that if you were not knowing his juridical philosophy, you couldn't be a lawyer either, was the, in fact, quite famous Bartolus of Sassoferrato. Sassoferrato is Sentinum, by the way, like if you want some classical echo there. And he wrote a treatise that was literally titled De Tyranno, so ablative of subject, so on tyranny, right, in Latin, identifying essentially 10 key characteristics of a tyrant, right? And the interesting aspect that is, sounds quite Machiavellian to some degree, is that some of these characteristics could be justified politically by legitimate rule, right? So it's like, just you see how pre-humanistic this is. This is fully already within the temper of what Machiavelli would make more famous to himself, right? But the idea that you have that the ends justify the means, at least in the fallen reality of, say, real government, of human government, for the even the positive gain of the community is alive in this time in history. Consider, I made some videos about the period we've seen like different, there were some different philosophies. There was like the legitimization of especially secular authority, and especially these communes, like it's only the, you see that in the traditional political order, like there wasn't such a thing like the concept of independence, like the in an absolute sense. The only ones were the Florentines that at some point in just in a, I think it was the same Salutati came up with the idea that in theory, like a single community did not have to obey anyone on earth, nor the empire nor the papacy. It's something that remained just on paper. Nobody really, like the Florentine government never made this thing their own, because obviously like the imperial Catholic tradition is extremely clear about, of course, the fact that that there is no such thing like freedom unless you're God yourself, but liberty, which is another idea. But just for saying that if you want to look at some early sparks of concepts that today, aside from the moral implications, are very much like modern and widespread, also in Western civilization, like just look at 14th century Italy, because that's where they were being formed, not even from before to much, to some extent at least. Right now, Bartolus, at the end of his treatise, had himself, in fact, blurred the dividing line between the just ruler and the tyrant. Right? That there is a passage, like, let's paraphrase this. Essentially, public good alone is not realistically attainable, Bartolus says. Like, there is always some degree of tyranny and corruption. This is a very, again, deep metaphysical universal realization. Humans are rigged by sin, and as we were saying before, there cannot be, in this sense, even absolute freedom for anyone unless you're God yourself. We're fallen, and we always have our degree of corruption. Think about in how contemporary fake news propaganda, like if you have a power that is just maybe one guy turns out to be corrupted, now these are the evil guys, the entire system, the entire country, the entire culture is corrupt. And these are the people that mostly do this from countries that are corrupted by declared identity, nationally wide, and with macroscopical evidence. Of course, we live in an age in which you can fool not just the chicken-brained people in general, but like the fact if you're constantly bombarded just by a very selective amount of information that can be drawn easily from the broader amount that we have sort of stopped even attempting to frame into a single concept like the medievals were capable of doing, because I don't think these guys had less to learn than you do. As a matter of fact, it's just an impression. Information is not knowledge necessarily, right? Learn from these people. Like how much you can today, palpate the decadence that existed compared to these guys' political theory in the Middle Ages. It was incredibly lucid and incredibly just realistic, accurate, right, about the current situation of mankind, right? And in fact, Bartels goes as far as saying that only God basically could really operate exclusively for the common welfare, and so I add in particular, like governments should be able to accept this in the degree by which this twisted element sort of can go still, however, at the benefit of the individual community, which is not a universal community, right? And so it's a bit like the idea, and we talked about this in the videos about the origins of chivalry and from war bands, etc., that you must shed blood. There must be a sacrificial victim in order to elevate yourself, to transcend your own nature. And this does happen through sin, right? And this is not just a Christian thing. This is inherent in the capacity of killing some life in order to actually create more. Life has power fundamentally, more power to another, because this is more qualitatively productive, and part of this quality emerges from the epuration of the evil that is incarnated by the succumbing party that was not strong enough to support its own capacity. This is the hardcore of the imperial Catholic tradition, well through millennia before Christ. You perfectly know in Schwerpunkt, if you're a long-term follower, that of course in pagan times Catholicism was there absolutely and brilliantly as well. So here we are finding extremely fascinating concept. I made some videos about William of Ockham and Marsilius of Padua that are they're also discussing these issues, and they're reflecting on the various, also on the responsibility of lay and ecclesiastical power. I talk about the Judius Romanus, about Dante, and indeed Italy is the cradle of all these concepts, again, well before the Renaissance. In any case, the Bartels is clear, like there are some important indicators can tell immediately whether that there is a degenerated form, also according to the Aristotelian divide, and not, right? So this is not moral relativism either, right? That's the sap of a civilization. Yes, the fact that every government is corrupt is true, but the degree by which this is a completely different story, right? In post-communist countries, people know exclusively the first part. Speak with a Russian, speak with a Chinese. Well, who the hell speaks with a Chinese? Nobody knows where they are. They cannot afford to understand the concept of quality and comparison. They don't understand that. They do not understand the difference between absolute and relative. It's completely missing. Like, there is just the sense that everything is rigged. Constant fear, constant paranoia, and political criticism and analysis in actual government is a completely different thing, right? So the Saint Bartholus tells us that there wasn't indeed, even in the pre-signorial regime, pure, free, and even less democratic, which was probably an unexisting concept in tradition, like pure community, right? That was not degraded, there wasn't violence or whatever, and this is actually pretty realistic, right? And this is for reminding what we said before about what is so despotic about the seigneurial era, at least in a broader international sense that was attached specifically to the Italian lordships. It's quite an untenable position, telling the truth. There is, if anything, if there was any violence, it's because at least any, say, apparently significant violence to compare with other systems is that because actually there was less power concentrated in the hands of fewer, right? Which, again, is probably would have not given us the Renaissance, right? If that had been the case. I mean, again, as I just said, look at that video I made on the way of the left hand, the path where the fire of death blazes. In order to transfigure and to rejuvenate in the imperial Catholic tradition, you must shed blood, right? This is a deeply an existentially constitutive element of the superiority of Western civilization, and this is being crossed out completely from your educational system on purpose, because we know that was the case. It was not just you have to go back in the millennia to know that. We wrote things about it pretty recently, and just they're not part of your curriculum in school or at school or at university, right? In any case, you can also see the rise of the Signori as a reaction to that same, in fact, instability in the previous phase, right? In the first half of the 13th century already, you see that, in order to fight against one another, even before Frederick II unleashed his force against the Lombard League, etc., you needed some sort of adequate political consent that, again, with the Podestas, mostly was materializing those generations. This was deriving from different dynamics. Now, I'm a military historian. I would mostly focus on the struggle between the milites and the pedites, right? That, however, should never understood even in that case in a classistic sense. But after the first Lombard League, the war against Barbarossa, the tension between the consular knights and the popular infantry was evident, because infantry was becoming to be very tough, right, and to resist even the imperial cavalry charges for a consistent amount of time, and they saved, at least without them, the day could not have been won in multiple occasions. So these guys wanted more rights of representation, and very often these guys were the expression of private associations within, again, we are still in the pre-statal dimension of the commune, with clans, factions, guilds, neighborhoods of sort. Again, they are divided at different vertical or horizontal level now. I don't have the time to go back on that. There is also a sense that, of course, like in the Middle Ages, you needed a public authority of sort, right? Private attitudes to justice, local feuds, whatever, it was something serious. Like state civilization emerges because it teaches people who think they can't make justice by themselves and being too weak and ineffective to do that if they try to open their mouth to say something, great part of their teeth would be broken instantly. That's what actually makes the functionality of our state an incredible coercive power, right? If you threaten people's lives, whatever, one of the citizens, etc., I gun you down, and I don't give a fuck about the fact that you're a living being, right? And this is a virtue of civilization. I mean, it's something that we would not be supposed to do if we weren't fallen. But this is what we need in order to keep the system going and elevating ourselves, hopefully, back to God. The expression of political rivalry in street fighting and violent clashes had definitely jeopardized like the stability of and the further growth of the commune, right? When you think about mafia, well, that's basically it. Like, it's the idea that everybody does whatever they want on their own, and they want to create their own sort of mini-states where nobody can touch anything, right? The Cosa Nostra, what is ours? Like, this is a very, in fact, when you think about the concept of independence versus the one of liberty, reflect on it, because independence claimed by a human, so not by a deified man, is by itself a crime, right? It's this person is not up to being divinely powerful to dispose of an absolute freedom, because what's absolute freedom anyway? Like it's like just limited to yourself. And what is yourself in that regard? So why is like not I don't know, a piece of grass that you can step on, like maybe wanted by another person to take over the world through whatever he can learn from that and not mitigating his own freedom, right? If we were all one with God, there wouldn't be this problem, and that's the only scenario in which independence can exist. Otherwise, for the rest, there is liberty, which always entails, especially relatively to God, a subjection, a subordination, at least a way to grow yourself to that height, but understanding every time what your limits are, because they're essentially your self-imposed limits, right? So again, there is all a history that we will make step by step about how the Italian communes built that statal power that did not exist as such in the rest of communal history in Europe, and why it emerged there. Of course, there was a lot going on, even with private property, like the defense of the communal district. Right, there was a general threat posed by the neighboring communes, and there were many rural aristocrats that were fundamentally playing in both fields, so damaging the commune, whose forces were at some point targeting the specific traders, or at least those who were, in fact, habitually raiding the part of the public territory that was, of course, worked by the single citizens, the single noble. So it was an incredibly complicated thing. Again, that this is just war normally, but since the cities are all close to one another, but they're also extremely powerful and rich within their own district, it was extremely easy to interfere with one another. Right? They weren't far away. They all were like this. This world is all the world of the city, even in the countryside. Right? So everything was that intertwined. And so controlling the district becomes an increasingly pressing necessity by the government, because the supplies depend on that. Just you can't quite simply defend or patrol everything in this territory, so the enemy can always enter and make damage, and so you need an ever greater effort. I made a video to defend it. I made a video about how at the end, actually, the aristocracy, the rural aristocracy won, because when the bigger cities, states crushed the others, basically they subcontracted the subordinated signori of that city to the aristocrats that had led them into that city, by degrading the district from the countryside on their own. So it's an incredibly messed up situation. Naturally, these districts were all encapsulated. So the commune did have many different lands and castles within the district, but so many other groups had. And some of these groups were some of the same families from which the Signori would emerge, that were not secluded guys from the countryside. They were, again, ruling in different cities at different point, while gravitating around their own and preferably taking over there, right? So that's the interesting That's why it's so cool, right? Because it's just another level of civilizational development, and not the usual story of, again, the evil state that wants to oppress the poor little guy out there that wanted to be alone. That's not how it works, right? It's the other way around. Everybody wields a hell of a force, but at the end of the day, the one that managed to compact the greatest one is emerging victorious, and the trend, of course, is the one of the original state, of the just like modernity and, say, states as we know them in Europe and beyond, right? This mess, I've never made a video specifically on how the communes passed from being communes to city-states. In the Italian case, it's it's again an exception, but again, 1/4 of the European population lived in the peninsula, so it's definitely like a regional system on its own. But before the state, and largely you see the state emerges in parallel with the signories, even though the signories would not take over fully for another, like, for some generations, right? It's all a rudimentary, semi-private and provisional thing. Even if the communal system is very advanced from an early age, and the same existence of the commune as an institution is just a marvel in itself. There are all different eras and stages of development. So we talked about Ezzelino da Romano. Why? Well, first of all, because I want to spice up the video a little bit. It's not just vocabulary, historiography, and politics. It's history and reality. We will talk surely about Ezzelino more in depth in some other video, even though again, we should start making biographies rather, like make the regions, we should make historical characters. And Ezzelino is very interesting because of his background, a wealth that is sculpted by Frederick II, and who marries actually his natural daughter, Selvaggia. So the rules over such powerful places like Verona and other also Padua, the neighboring one, the rival one of Verona, that will eventually struggle again later when the Della Scala will, after the Ezzelini, as a matter of fact, will take over Verona, and receiving even there the imperial support against the Paduans, that were this more popular republican system comparatively. And there are again all issues of how also these communes regulate their own resources, and how maybe a smaller city was even more performing than a bigger one. We'll see it surely in another video. But it's important to mention this because most of what we know about Ezzelino belongs to an age that either was distant enough, especially the life of Ezzelino by the Paduan politician, but mostly historian, Albertinus Mussatus, living in the early 14th century, in the time in which these guys were full magistrates of the commune. They fought in the communal army, so the guy, there are interesting implications of all this all. And who, in that specific case, together with other sources that were anti-Frederick II and anti-Ghibellines, wanted to depict him like a sort of monster. Right? There is a very black legend about hanging on Ezzelino's historical figure. I talked both about Verona and Padua, so if you're interested, you can check those videos out and see how Ezzelino fared a bit more in context. Let's just say that the Da Romano were some of the most noble families of the so-called Trevisan mark, which was not really a mark within the empires. It was historically the mark of Verona, but eventually took the name after Treviso. It was just a geographical, political, and cultural area, essentially of northeastern Italy, separated from Lombardy, conceptually, and sort of also from the Far East, like the Friuli area, the Patriarchate of Aquileia. And the da Romano belonged, again, like the Este, they dated their ancestry to the time of Conrad the Salian, the legion that they descended from a knight of one of the Germanic expeditions. The most important thing, however, is that they were, aside from their origins, historical or not, one of the four preeminently lordly families of the Trevisan mark. The Trevisan mark was a bit slightly more of a feudal area compared to, say, Lombardy, which means that the communes were a bit weaker and the local rural aristocracy was more powerful. The da Romano had lots of lands in Bassano, between Treviso and Vicenza. Thus, they sort of influenced all these centers in different ways. You see, these were communes, but the aristocrats were quite powerful in these areas, and in spite of the power, especially of Verona and Padua, that were the main centers, like these others would try to sort of struggle for survival, and they relied in part, in fact, on the same lords that at some point would take over their rule, right? They're a very influential family. At this point in history, traditionally wealth, right? Already in the 1200s, the da Romano had been struggling with the other local clans, such as the San Bonifacio counts of Verona, who allied themselves with the Este of Ferrara, while the da Romano were allied with the Torelli that were also in Ferrara and opposed, in fact, the Este. So you see, and how many there are several tens, more than 100 kilometers in this broader space. Like it's not that small, and again, it's dotted with these communes and rural signories. As we will see, for example, with Uberto Pallavicino, there were between some communes, some entire stripes belonging of land belonging to some lords that acted as a sort of parallel authority. I made a video recently that I forgot the title of, but it was about, I think, the 12th century, that explains exactly what in northeastern Italy the situation was like in terms of again, the lords, individual powers, the communes, etc. So this is the century before, but it's still sort of eye-opening about where these guys came from. Yes, it's the video about Lothair the Third and Conrad the Third's Italic reigns. Right, so if you're interested, you can check that out. So the da Romano were controlling quite extensive assets across the Trevisan mark, leveraging power on it. The proof of this is how long the aforementioned clans' alignments were, right? How solid their power was to just remain more or less based on this kind of alliances. Of course, would change over time, but that were remarkably long-lasting, in fact, for the contemporary standards. For example, it's only after Ezzelino's death in 1259 that the Este and the San Bonifacio broke their alliance, right? Ezzelino, by the way, is Ezzelino the Third da Romano, right? Were others. Of course, it was truly dynastically minded individuals in the concept of, again, feudal lineage, and just considering the prestige and the status that they already had. You understand how also of course, the communal culture is intersected with the sort of feudal dynastic one to some extent. Except the communal one was stronger in Italy. In any case, we have different authors, not just Mussatus. We have Rolandinus of Padua. Padua has a lot of interesting chroniclers and some of the finest pre-humanistic historiography produced. Rolandinus tells us, Rolandinus de Passeggeri, that's these were all clans, they're all like families that were, part of the communal establishment, etc. This author tells us that the Mark was dominated for half a century by growing tension between the Este and the da Romano. And I made a video about the Cherokee and Donati War for Pistoia, Florence, etc. That's a Tuscan situation, but here it's similar, like the sort of legend about how these conflicts originated. And before the second half of the, say, mid-13th century historiography, you do not have, say, incredibly accurate information about how these conflicts began, right? Historiography, literature were developing fast, rampantly, but also the way, in fact, for these authors to gather information about the previous times was sort of limited compared, of course, to our historiography. And so there is this story, just like for the Cherokee, the Donati War, that the issue was a woman, right, a marriage specifically. Where so the one between the Este and the da Romano, according to Rolandinus, was over the marriage to an heiress between the da Romano and another important faction of Verona, allied to the Este, that were the Campo San Piero. It's always the same story, like some issue that it's even realistic to some extent. It's plausible that these marriages were very important patrimonial issues. The clans had a great power. They used their girls as specific political pawns. There was a lot of wealth at stake, and so it's realistic that these agreements, etc., because marriages were also contracted to put ends to feuds, to this sort of, again, these guys also were ostentating power and showing off, and of course they would hope for some dynastic reason to merge their own wealth and power. So there is a dynastic tendency from the clan to become something more concentrated, right? So this story may be a literary invention, but again, the dowries were quite expensive. It's a realistic thing. There is much more than that at stake. Of course, it's the control in the single cities by these aristocratic families. We have Azzo d'Este becoming Podesta of Verona in 1207. So the Podesta, we explained it many times, was a guy that was called to obey local constitution, mostly leading the army during war and coming from another city so that he could be super partes. But as you understand here, you called a guy that is allied with some guys from the same Verona, some of the most important families of the Trevisan Mark. And so, in fact, predictably, Ezzelino II gathered some military force to expel the guy. All right. Then another member of the Este, Aldovrandino, resisted the Paduan claims to jurisdiction over his castles and his estates in the southern part of the district of the Commune of Padua. on this occasion, Ezzelino joins the Paduan communal army that raided the lands of Aldobrandino d'Este. Now this is very interesting because it shows you how naturally, like, Ferrara and Padua are not that distant. I mean, there is the Po River and the Adige River in between, but the districts are basically bordering, right? So it would be completely normal that if you were one of these clans, you would have lands not just in your own city district, but also in, say, the next one, and again interfering in the local affairs. So the Paduan commune wants to assert control over the southern part. In fact, that's the part in the direction of Ferrara, on this where Este actually lays, because Este is the original town after which also the family takes place. It's actually from the district of Padua, right? Then again, the Este are incredibly old. They descend from, again, some of the Frankish lineages that came with the Carolingians. The Welfen dynasty are actually a branch of the Este that came from back to, like, these guys I think were from, if I remember correctly, it may have been from the Mark of Brittany, and then they went to Italy, and then at some point the Welfen are, as you know, one of the most successful families in Germany, because came back. We talk about them with Bavaria, with and it's, again, they're inextricably intertwined with the Italian affairs as well. And the Paduans, as we were saying before, as a commune, are struggling to enforce control over the district, and this guy becomes the target of it because, of course, the Paduans, for many reasons, were also aligned at this point with, incidentally, with the da Romano. And of course, this is a great affront to the Este for both involved. This is also the time in which Ezzelino III is capable, through the support of the Hohenstaufen, to rise to power over essentially the entire Trevisan Mark. We are in the years 1228 to 1236. He managed to dominate Verona, Padua, and Vicenza. Frederick II had thus ensured the passage from the Adige Valley, like from Germany to Italy, through the Brenner Pass that Verona controlled, Verona being the most important city, again, in the Mark. It had specifically been seized by Ezzelino at the request of the Monticoli clan, and so that's how he had. You see how this could occur. Like, you have some support inside the city, and you manage to, like, by balance of power, to oust the other rival families that are exiled, their house towers razed, etc. Many of these people naturally take refuge into the countryside where they have castles, etc. So they remain there to some extent. To some other, the commune manages to raise even those to the ground, some of those on the ground, etc. Ezzelino had occupied Vicenza in 1236 and Padua in 1237, thanks to the imperial support, and he essentially controlled them until his death. Rolandinus tells us that Ezzelino's rise to power was particularly violent. Alright, that the expulsions from the city began almost immediately in Padua, which is also not so strange, telling the truth, when you see this ostracism in the various Italian communes. But it's pretty obvious, like a faction takes over the city, like the others flee, or their possession taken over, etc. And that's what had brought Ezzelino to be called Lord, even though this was, again, also a term that we're not sure whether it was used, particularly these authors, are all pretty biased. Specifically, usually they aren't. They're actually very accurate, and also these stories are real. But of course, there is a even a level of dramatization. For example, Musatos wrote a tragedy, like literally the title, the genre was sort of poem about Ezzelino. So it's not necessarily the insightful history that he also was able to write, right? And the guy had lived generations before, and there were these other chronicles that at the time were not as insightful or detailed, but said, okay, if you were a Guelph, you hated this guy, you would write negative things about him. So as a consequence of Ezzelino's rise to power, which was insane, like for the time standards, let's remember that, as we were saying before, there were other, say, overlords like Albert of Pallavicino, William VII of Montferrat. Those are true especially for Lombardy. We'll see it on another occasion. But ruling 3 cities at once was insane, was really new, was really like the emperor managing to co-opt a guy who could become a sort of, create a feudal, like not a feudal state, but let's say a state of some sort by just controlling these 3 cities. So that's why by the 40s of the 13th century, in some of the greatest struggles against between the Guelphs, the Pope, and the Emperor, like a figure like Ezzelino would be so unusual, exceptional, and hated, and whatever. But if you look at how this also happened politically, it was somehow normal, together with the pretty bloody sequence of battles that unavoidably were unavoidably necessary for the control of the districts. As we were saying before, the interland required ravaging the territories of the enemy clans, the execution of war captives to some extent, and also of unmasked plotters. So the idea is that Ezzelino was using the iron fist and was taking out his political opponents, because he felt substantially backed by, again, the highest blood ever, like the one of the Holy Roman Emperor, whose daughter he had married, by the way. So think what that means for this guy's status, and especially someone that's still in a fully traditionally and universally founded reality is descending himself from some of the noblest bloods, at least, and has an enormous power to factually, like, just be that high in power, right? Frederick II dies in 1250, so this left temporarily the Ghibellines without much of a guidance that would be filled like by the Earl of Manfred, the natural son of Frederick II, that would become King of Sicily, and so brother-in-law, by the way, to Ezzelino, but also the uncle of first of all the half-brother of Conrad IV that descends to Italy and dies in a campaign in southern Italy, with Manfred next to him, by the way, and especially uncle to Conrad's son, that was Conrad, whose throne he basically usurped before he died, as you know, as the Angevins arrived later, and Conrad went to southern Italy to recover the kingdom of Sicily, and he was defeated and was executed at the same time. The Hohenstaufen had a pretty dramatic, tragical history. Ezzelino participates to this, if you want. He temporarily required the support of the Dalismanini and their allies that were former allies to him, but that he had sort of abandoned temporarily, right? There were plots discovered even within his own household as a consequence because of this temporary weakness. Eventually, he's supported by Manfred, that is continuing. I made a video about Manfred of Sicily. He continues a truly Mediterranean policy, like his father, and he has a plan of Italian hegemonization, just like the Angevins would do later, which was also the moment of greatest ideological intensification of the imperial and papal propagandas. This is an incredibly important passage because already under Frederick II, we especially have the papal side of the story, because just the papacy was better equipped propagandizing, but the same was for the imperial side. Things like, I don't know, Frederick being the Antichrist. We talked recently about the Franciscans. We've seen how the Joachimites and had expressed of course the proximity of the end of the world, and chronicler we will mention now, living at the same period of Frederick, thought that there was a Joachimite, son in Ben of Parma, thought that the emperor was the Antichrist. He was actually very honest by saying, look, this was because the Joachimites had some prophecies regarding current times, and the guy thought to have identified, of course, for obvious reasons, Frederick as the greatest power that had to come to rule the world before the second advent of Christ in Frederick. And so when the emperor died, there should have been the end of the world. And of course, the end of the world did not happen. And Son and Bennett said, I was wrong. So the intellectual honesty of people that hated the guy, right? Because they were very, very papal, very, very wealth in like he was a mendicant, but it's not about that. There were some clergymen that were Ghibelline as well, but just for saying how sometimes the Ghibellines were sort of the more, you see, this, we just saw it like they were just like any other. I mean, Ezzelino became a Ghibelline himself from being a Guelph, but the idea is that the imperial side is more like the lay, seigneurial, military, feudal one, and so there is less, in theory, also written by these guys that pass to the sword more. It's just a stereotype, but it's part of the reason why, eventually Manfred was, the Hohenstaufen were over, the Angevins took over, so there was surely a degree of damnatio memoria, even though we are fairly well documented about everything that happened for the times being, especially in a region like Italy, and let's say that's how the losers go. It's completely wrong to think that history is written by victors. Ask Polybius or Flavius Josephus for that matter. Doesn't mean really anything. But in this case, of course, we miss some pieces of evidence because the guys also were the broader losers and were depicted a bit in this way. There was even a crusade, in fact, launched against Ezzelino in 1256, which became, on the narratives of all these Guelph chronicles of the Trevisan Mark, that eventually emerged better when the guy was out of power, and so there were all these people resenting against his, when he died, like resenting against his former rule, that galvanized like the hatred also ideologically against the guy, because he was allied with Manfred as an excommunicated as well. But Ezzelino's power was really strong, which means also that there were lots of people supporting him. He captured the papal legate in 1258. Hell of a strike, symbolically. He also occupied Brescia, in Lombardy, which is just across the Lake Garda, right west of Verona, Veronese district. He even succeeded in defeating and capturing his former ally and current rival in Lombardy, Uberto Pallavicino, that we mentioned before, this very powerful clan having an enormous estates between Parma and Piacenza, who also had risen as Ezzelino, as a sort of lord over multiple cities, even if in a less concentrated and tyrannical way, just that we are talking about the term. This is interesting again. That's why I say that we should make a video dedicated entirely about the guy's life, because there were all battles, different sort of political intrigues behind the balance of all these various communes to allow the victory and the defeat of the individual leaders. So unfortunately for Ezzelino, fortunately and unfortunately, we have all this sort of biased chronically, chronicles on him, which on one side inform us about his life, but on the other are very much against him. It's a bit of an exception. Like, there is objectively not a figure in Italian communal history that was, let's say, represented in such tyrannical terms. You see, they're not evil, harsh, denigrating. The guy was admired, otherwise they would have not even made a chronicle over him. This, say, power and prestige and nobility and things like physical beauty were extremely appreciated as a mark of leadership and authority and divine blessing, right, in these traditional cultures. And that's why, however, this was made an example of the guy who sort of had everything and exceeded his powers, just like, I don't know, different other examples of tyrants in history. Guys who were exceptionally equipped and endowed, but that used their power for evil rather than for good, right? There was no other, even lord, ever mythologized in the same way. So that's why it's a bit of an exception. Yes, the guy was seen as evil because of the Papal Crusade. That was especially the big deal. But at the same time, like, there is no proof that personally he was any better or worse than other leaders at the time. We do not have much of a public documentation of his rule. There is something here and there. We know that he was an effective governor. He was very much warlike. Surely people who spent their life on horseback between sieges and battles. In fact, he died as a consequence of one. There is a lot, in fact, about his death that is seen as, of course, the perfect tragical figure, hence Mussato's Ezzelini tragedia, right? Mussato wrote this drama on the anniversary of liberation from Ezzelino in Padua, which gives you an idea of how much, let's say, ingrained in the mythology of the local history and political symbolism the guy had become. Is it really a mark of relevance, whoever this guy had been, that was deserving such celebration in spite of the dark aura it was sowed on him. The most common rhetorical device to show how sort of bad Ezzelino was bloodshed. Alright, the Italians actually were extremely belligerent at this point, as we were saying before. They had a great sense of, let's say, the power of their communal armies. As a matter of fact, the truest identity of the commune was the one of citizens in arms, according to the Romano-Germanic tradition, and freemen in that limited sense means noblemen to a limited sense. Of being a citizen there was, remember, these were the guys who had brought down the feudal lineages of noblemen, so they saw themselves traditionally as endowed just by bearing arms, like with that degree of imperium themselves. Plus, again, the leaders were true knights in the first place. But aside from this, the political violence, we can say the civic violence, the idea of going against the communal laws that were what bonded the city together, like the community together, identically, was of course, considered as a crime, right? If you cut to pieces people, like, I don't know, during a raid in the enemy countryside, well, there's a bunch of rustics, who the hell cares? But if you, of course, were particularly violent against, for example, your political opponents in the city, especially if these were quite powerful people, which is actually what matters in here, you would be seen as a monster, as a tyrant, as a matter of fact. So at least in these chronicles, the story is that Ezzelino killed lots of people in terrible ways, and sometimes actually out of reasons of actual justice, but in a way like that was atrocious enough as a mean to be seen as this guy is some sort of bad guy in the first place. Much of these informations are topoi derived from biblical horrors. For example, the massacre of the innocents is a very common theme. Also, if you look at the beautiful Italian art of the time in frescoes, etc., here I inserted some of those pictures. In fact, that this fit the broader sense of these massacres occurring at the time. Indeed, if you read the Chronicles, you realize the degree of bloodshed that occurred at some point. The aforementioned Franciscan friar Salimbene of Parma, author of one of, again, the most important chronicles of the 13th century, wrote, to record all his Ezzelino's cruelties would require a large book. He was as much the devil's special friend as St. Francis was the Christ's, right? Now, Salimbene was a Franciscan, so these guys now were fully, of course, I made a video recently explaining how the Franciscans, the Dominicans, became the most educated professors, doctors of European universities. At this point, they had equipped themselves all with the ideological and technical tools to, in fact, propagandize, etc. In fact, some of the most ideological histories from the time supporting the papacy and creating the Dark Legions, also about, for example, Manfred having killed his father Frederick II. Complete falsities. Martin Polonus, by the way, was an Hungarian Dominican, wrote this Dominican. He, complete historical fiction without any foundation whatsoever. But they're also the product of that ideological temper and the incredibly effective, as intelligent, as splendid, and brilliant papal ideology that was achieving and winning in this regard as well. So Salimbene was a bit biased, as we've seen. He was also a bit of he actually came from a prosperous family, and he knew, he admits that he was very municipally minded, right? The Italian campanalism, the idea that he felt, for example, to be very Parmesan and to remember as a Parmesan things and not to forget them because of feuds and revenge and things like that. And Salimbene's work, for example, stresses the fear and the butchery as really the cornerstones of Ezzelino's power. If you went against his rule, you would be killed. But again, if you look at the political landscape of the times, there is no way to say whether Ezzelino was actually more or less ruthless than others. Actually, the entire landscape was pretty violent in itself. So historically, it's possible that Ezzelino was that sort of cruel. But it's possible also better that even if he killed lots of people, it was because he had a lot of power and a lot of enemies, right? Not necessarily because he had any sort of evil inclination more than these as well, right? So this view that, as we were saying before, takes a bit on from the character from the tragic works of classical times, together with sort of imagery and psychological introspection, the fear of the plot, right? A bit like the paranoia of being taken down, this obsession for power that is unstable, and so you need to take out your enemies because otherwise you will fall. Like, this is all about these stories, together with tortures, mutilations, executions, etc. Again, this is not, sponsored, for example, so much for later violences were carried out, in the time of the soldiers of fortune. Or at least it is, but not to this mythological level, right? It's sort of, okay, well, look at that, it's war. So what's this, and why should we exactly believe this story? Just for that matter. So that, especially in Padua and in the general, especially in northern Italy, the figure of Ezzelino was still echoing by the 14th century as the sort of the perfect model for the worst type of secular ruler. And this mostly because of the success of the ecclesiastical propaganda and historiography against the Ghibellines, right? Which were accused of heresy, of all the what we factually know to be wrong, to be made up, which strangely enough people today believe, as if those sources at the time had been written for the purposes that of us getting the information for today, for the historical interest that we have today. That's an incredibly self-centered and narcissistic disorder. Like these people were writing for a specific end that had nothing to do with you, or even if it does, it's filtered through several hundred years of history that, of course, has changed completely the way you should read these things. There are people who literally believe, I don't know, that Boniface VIII was a monster, that just because of very specific and also notoriously studied and researched and common knowledge in academia and since centuries, not even generations, made up stories for specific political purposes. I mean, go around YouTube and search how many people think that Boniface VIII was actually a monster. And people actually believe that, right? They have no clue why the idea came around, while the story was flared, right? The colonnades propaganda, the role of Philip IV. They have zero idea about what we perfectly know on the basis of sources, how these were made in order to make this guy look in a certain way, and it has nothing to do with the accusations that he was thrown against, that were the ones that habitually, in medieval politics, both sides constantly threw at one another. Which is, again, if you do not know these things, it means you literally do not know the ABC of the era. But not hyperbolically, but I mean literally, and notoriously so, among the competents, let's say. There is a funny anecdote about this, that is to say, for example, that Matteo Visconti, the leader of say, the Lord of Milan specifically, the founder properly of the continuity of the Visconti rule in Milan, was, and I made a video about this, excommunicated, and a crusade was launched against him, similarly, as a Ghibelline leader, and just having support, having been brought to power by Henry VII, having been brought to power. They were already there, but there had been problems with the Delator, etc., exiles, etc. The guy, the Pope, decides to knock him out, and among the charges that were brought against him as an heretic, as an excommunicated, was the standard pack. Like, everybody that was just excommunicated was all that other stuff according to the papacy, even there was no evidence. The latter being made up in the interesting idea that Matteo Visconti would have been worshipping the bones of Ezzelino da Romano as the relics of a saint, but even at least the opposite of it, as an heretic. Again, pursuing an evil man as a model. Another man died excommunicated, and of the same mold of those damned Ghibellines that wanted to oppress the papacy, to rule it impositively, right? So everybody was playing their game in many ways. Of course, Matteo Visconti was not an heretic, so Farinata del Ghiberti was not, right? Just over, not Manfred was not, Ezzelino was not. But this is again the accusation, and then for us, like, oh look, this guy was excommunicated. They said he was an heretic. So what is there behind it? Like, is it true? Is it not true? This is like, if you study the history, it's not an opinion that is not true. It's just like, we know that this was just a standard pack of accusations, just to proceed towards a certain direction, and these people were normal Christians without any doctrinal, theological deviation of sort. Just they fell in the wrong political side, like from the papacy. Right? Saint Frederick II had said that the Pope was the Antichrist, right? And as the guy in office, not the institution, of course, nobody thought to do so at this point. The papal propaganda being, however, better, and so making a greater effect overall. But if you know how they did this, also largely orally, not just written, so also in ways that we cannot fully document, but that was this world before modern communication. Of course, it could work like it was like all over the place, like the entire communities revolve around this stuff. Naturally, we do have some evidence, as we were saying before, of Ezzelino's sober rule to some extent. Again, there is no doubt that the guy was pretty heavy-handed in some ways, but again, he was at war. He was just struggling against coups. How do you cope with that? We show him actually respecting the communal constitutions, which was, again, part of the reason why he was in power. You see, what I'm sure by mere tendency and instinct, the audience can be led astray by, is that since the guy was a lord, and now you see the same propaganda seated in, he was so heavy, etc. This guy was, so powerful, he was lording over these communes. No, there is no evidence of that. There is the evidence that these communes were, of course, under like Ezzelino's rule, but his position was the one that the local constitutions allowed him in communes that remain, in fact, pretty, in which the Signori, even when it remained, like with the La Scala in Verona, etc., was pretty mild. We know that, and so in times of war, things could be worse. But in general, right, there was no need for that, even to alter the communal constitution. And we know how the communal constitutions evolved. And there is no evidence here of any harshening of the picture, or some exceptional power given to this guy that suspended the rights, or what. No, there's totally zero about this. We see, on the contrary, actually, the expansion of representation in the communal councils of Padua and Verona during the 50s of the 13th century under Ezzelino's rule. We see the artisans being more represented. So we are sure, by the way, that Ezzelino enjoyed some substantially popular support. Again, this is about like if the people was with him, generally speaking, like because the establishment was with him, like it's not that Ezzelino was a particularly pro-popular guy, or that these guys were just supporting him for populistic reasons. In general, like what you mean by the people entails different, actually powerful groups that represent certain guilds. I made a video about these in the Italian communes recently, and that are also representative of a section of the army, of like people that can give power in the first place. Rolandino, as a great lord, was also respected. He lived up to some degree of chivalric and courtly standards. Like the communes are not something different from other courts in terms of magnificence, of wealth. On the contrary, there is a great imitation also of the feudal models. There is a sense of, again, courtesy intended as capacity to, for example, reinvest the accumulated wealth in order to strengthen the clientels, that there is a general cooperation in terms of like what do you give me in exchange for power, etc. So this is completely normal. The same Rolandinus states this. The author records, for example, Ezzelino's speech made in Monselice, it's a town, the Trevisan Mark in 1237, that discussed, and adverts, of course, the bad government in the Mark. I made some videos about the importance of rhetoric in the Italian communes and how these political speeches were, of course, biased and whatever, but there was also broader debate about what a true and good ruler had to be, what a regime had to work like, and how the local government and constitutions had to work to adapt, and which direction to take, right? So Ezzelino, even by the hostile sources, is represented as quite firm against criminals, murderers, rapists, thieves. So again, people, like I say, it just because of the aforementioned biases that exist. I don't know, in the Anglo-Saxon world, there is a market, in the academia, there is a marked distrust towards narrative sources. Chronicles are false. Why? Because in English history, during the Middle Ages, mostly you had monarchic sources, because there wasn't much of, say, at least it was a history of kings and courts and nobility, right? In communal Italy, at this point, you have a civic republican communal historiography, which is a completely different thing. The people who write are the same ones who take part in the politics at the time, and even when they talk about the past, they're not writing for else but the broader community that is going to read them, which is much larger, is a body of wealthy, literate citizens in arms that cover political offices, and people know the story already, so you're not tricking them into some ideological divagation about what a king wants to hear, right? This is what the shared past, a shared identity through history, which is also, of course, made up, as you were saying before, but it is for purposes that are different from the ones for which you would think you could simply distrust information as such. And of course, what was the point of depicting Ezzelino at a couple of generations of distance in a way that he had not been in some way? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Consider this, that even the violence that is depicted, if you read these sources, like this is not to say, oh my god, we're so shocked that this guy was so violent. They say, this guy did this stuff. And yes, overall, like, you can understand from certain words and certain general considerations that the guy is adverse to him and that they didn't like him also for these reasons, etc. But overall, like, yeah, it's just a story. Like, they want to tell it to you. Like, it's not based on the just the shock effect that this violence could trigger. There was also a consensus, for example, among especially the wealth popular regimes like the ones of Padua that would mostly express this. Also Parma with Salimbene that we mentioned was very popular in nature. This is very important to understand where the Chronicle comes from, so that it's not just the faction but even the background, like what did they think in that commune specifically. Like, taking out proud aristocrats was seen as okay, because there was this general, it's a bit like in the Roman Senate, they didn't want to have a king, a sole ruler, right? So they were all aristocrats and oligarchically oriented and whatever. They were fine with this shared power. But the guy who arrived with the iron fist and wanted to control more was seen as, okay, let's take him out. And this is done in these chronicles. This is written also for the enemies of Ezzelino that were taken out by him. Some certain guys that were sort of too powerful, too arrogant, too violent themselves. Ezzelino takes them out, and he's kind of the devil of the situation, but he can't do that because he is cool, right? And so it's just like, I don't know, what are the sort of dark heroes or sort of tragic heroes that sort of are damned, but in this sense they can't take out other people who deserve that with them. It's full of movies in just broader storytelling and broader archetypes, this kind of dynamic. The chronicler Maurizio, which was complicatedly as say probably unreliably explaining the meaning of Ezzelino's name, saw in it, in the term, the corrector of the proud. It's a sort of, omen deriving from the guy's name that was also a dynastic name, as you understood. We see this was the third guy of the line, who would, quote, put down the mighty from their seats and exalt them of low degree. So even saying that the guy was actually a bit more of somebody who picked people even from lesser status if they were good, and that he would put them in charge, like in charge of some degree of power, as opposed to other guys born and raised into some of the most powerful families that, however, were sort of ineffective or criminals or something like that. So it's there is a sense of justice that in theory is created around the guy, that is thus sort of archetype, if you want, especially for this dramatic narratives. Also, again, the fact that the guy was dead from a couple generations. Well, it's not the entirety of the situation here, but also like make it easier to talk about him. Also, so, but the bases are true. Like the bases are at least founded on actual communal memory of Ezzelino's life. That was, again, also very complicated. There are lots of studies on Ezzelino because there are so many different things you can study from all the various ways he treated, I don't know, certain communities here and there in this vast Trevisan Mark, castles, villages, the same communes, the international relations, all the European alignments of the time. that are so important, that are so relevant, and capable of providing with substantial, say, objective information to reconstruct what this guy is. I mean, you think that, I don't know, Frederick II's life has been studied satisfactorily. Every time you study something about Frederick II, there is something new that comes up. Notoriously enough, like, don't think we have studied history in general well. I mean, the fundamentals in Western historiography are pretty damn sound and good. But these are just like a launch pad for further research that is yet to be carried out en masse on all these topics. And so we should be lucky, should be feeling the grace, like the thankfulness for what we have and what we can do with history, right? And being a bit more humble also sometimes, looking at our times, realizing what they are in their context, and looking at the past and saying, wait a minute, we come from this. Let's see what they did in order to allow us to be the way we are. Right? This is extremely important in a general sense. And again, talking about communal Italy is always very interesting. It's one of my favorite topics, as you have understood. I definitely research mostly about the Holy Roman Empire, like Germany, Italy, mostly. Like, these are like very some of the most important fields, and again, in Western history, you can't really do without them. The most important thing is being careful, being precise, being honest with yourself. Right? That's the most important thing. We will naturally talk again about all these topics individually. Hopefully so, like if I continue doing it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.